Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into the really complex life of J. Robert Oppenheimer.
That's right. We're looking at the man, the science, and especially those huge moral questions that came out of his work, drawing from the biography we've both been reading.
Oppenheimer. You hear the name, you immediately think Manhattan Project, atomic bomb.
Exactly. He was this incredibly brilliant physicist who led the whole thing,
Yeah.
a scientific leader.
And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? This amazing scientific breakthrough happening right alongside these, well, deeply troubling moral issues. It's fascinating.
It really is. And it wasn't just his dilemma. It became, and still is, a dilemma for all of us, you know?
Right. So for this deep dive, we want to explore that tension, that aha moment in science versus the ethical fallout. And we'll try to do it without getting totally bogged down in like the super technical physics. Focus on the human story.
Absolutely. And his background is just so rich. It wasn't just science. He had this privileged upbringing, sure, but also this intense curiosity.
And art, right. His mother was a painter.
Yeah, Ella Friedman. So he had art, literature, plus this ethical culture philosophy from his parents, emphasizing reason and doing the right thing.
Plus, exposure to the big scientific ideas floating around, Einstein, Curie, it all kind of simmered together.
Made for a very complex person, even before he got anywhere near an atom bomb.
Okay, let's start there then. Early life. His father, Julius.
Yeah, Julius Oppenheimer. Came over from Germany, really ambitious, built a successful business importing textiles, hard worker, set the family up well in New York.
That drive must have been part of the household atmosphere.
Oh, I think so. That immigrant success story,
Yeah.
building something. But then you had his mother, Ella, the artistic side.
She nurtured his interest in books and aesthetics. Their home sounds like it was kind of a cultural hub.
Definitely. They embraced ethical culture, too, which is interesting. It's not a religion, exactly, more a philosophy focused on ethics, relationships, reason.
And that seems key, doesn't it? Giving him this ethical framework early on, a framework he'd later wrestle with.
For sure. And imagine being a kid in that house. Intellectuals, artists visiting, talking about everything, plus all that art on the walls, Van Gogh, Picasso.
Wow. Soaking all that in, it wasn't just a narrow scientific upbringing at all.
Not at all. It was broad. It laid the groundwork for a mind that can, think on multiple levels.
Then his brother Frank was born later in 1912. How did that change things?
Well, any sibling changes the dynamic, right? Robert was the center of attention before that. The biography suggests it was maybe a subtle shift at first, though.
And the parents' personalities. Julius sounds warmer, loved Beethoven. Ella more reserved.
Yeah, that's the picture painted. Different influences there. Helps you understand the environment.
What about this ethical education under John Lovejoy Eliot? That sounds significant.
It really does. Eliot pushed this idea of an ethical imagination, being able to see the bigger picture, the moral consequences of actions.
That feels like planting a seed, doesn't it? For the huge moral struggles later on.
Exactly. Knowledge isn't neutral. It comes with responsibility. That's a heavy idea for a young mind.
Then he got sick, went to New Mexico to recover. That seems like a pivotal experience.
Huge. The landscape itself, the starkness, the beauty, it really affected him. And he made important friendships there, outside his usual circles. The Fergusons, Paul Horgan.
When we start seeing the complexity emerge, right? Intense curiosity, yeah, but also social awkwardness, struggles.
Definitely. That weird swimming incident, quitting a summer job. Little glimpses of someone maybe not entirely comfortable in his own skin, wrestling with things.
Maybe intellectualizing his feelings, seeing loneliness as sort of the price of being smart, even while wanting connection.
That rings true. Then Harvard. Academically brilliant, obviously. But he himself felt he was sometimes bluffing. Covering a lot of ground, but not always deeply.
Got by with murder, I think he said. Interesting self-awareness.
Yeah. And that summer back in New Mexico in 25, with Frank and Horgan, it feels like going back to a safe place.
Before plunging into the next stage, he got rejected by Rutherford, the big name in experimental physics.
He did. But then, accepted by J.J. Thomson at Cambridge, another giant. So, Europe was calling.
Right. He knew his path was physics, and at that time, Europe was really the center.
So off he went to Cambridge.
Okay, so Cambridge. And this period, Autumn 25, seems rough. He's lost the structure of Harvard.
Yeah, a real crisis point, it seems. Emotional turmoil. The safety net was gone.
And then the poisoned apple incident. Patrick Blackett. That's dark.
It really is very disturbing. Suggests some serious inner conflict, maybe impulsivity. And he confessed, or it was found out. Either way, a really troubling moment.
He even saw psychiatrists but felt the doctor couldn't keep up with him.
Right. Too stupid to follow him was the quote, I think.
Yeah.
Which could be arrogance or maybe masking deep vulnerability, you know?
Followed by suicidal thoughts while he was in Brittany. He was really struggling.
Profoundly. A major personal crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But then Göttingen and Max Born.
Ah, the turning point.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
Born became a real mentor, gave him direction in theoretical physics, which is where he needed to be.
And Göttingen itself was buzzing, right? All these amazing minds. Frank, Jordan, Hahn, von Neumann.
Incredible environment. He wasn't isolated anymore. He was part of this, revolutionary wave in physics. Must have been exhilarating.
Though the struggles weren't totally gone, there was that fainting incident.
Yeah, suggesting the inner tension was still there. But mostly, this was where he found the joy of collaboration, started publishing, gained confidence.
His reputation started to grow, but he was intense in seminars, interrupting, taking over.
Oh yeah, that restless intellect probably rubbed some people the wrong way, even if it was stimulating.
Didn't seem to help with relationships much. That brief thing with Charlotte Serber ended.
Right. The gift of the satchel, then it fizzled. Intimacy seemed difficult. He met Dirac briefly, too, another brilliant, maybe socially awkward physicist.
So he goes back to Harvard, a changed person, but Cambridge isn't home anymore. He's longing for New Mexico again.
Yeah, that landscape really called to him. He went back with Frank in 28. Sounds like they bonded more then.
Quick stop in Leipzig, meets Heisenberg, another future giant.
Cautious mutual respect, seems like. Then Berkeley. Late 20s. This is where he really starts to build his own world.
Yeah, his school of theoretical physics. He even tried making nasi goreng for people. Sounds like he wanted to create a whole experience.
He did, bringing culture into it.
Yeah.
And he attracted brilliant students. Berkeley became the place for theoretical physics in the U.S., largely because of him.
And he was collaborating with students, not just lecturing. That work on neutron stars with Volkov.
The Oppenheimer-Volkov limit, yeah.
Yeah.
Crucial stuff. And the paper on black holes with Snyder, published literally the day WWII started. Incredible timing.
But he knew he wasn't an experimentalist. He respected guys like Ernest Lawrence at the Rad Lab.
Absolutely. He understood his role was more theoretical, a catalyst maybe, bringing people together, sparking ideas.
Still struggled with closeness, though. Frank felt he'd vanished into his work.
Yeah, that's poignant. Building this intellectual empire, maybe at a personal cost.
But he tried. Shared wine, music, literature with students. Took them out. It wasn't just physics.
No, he wanted to cultivate well-rounded minds. That tea hour at Nadelsky's house sounds like a great example. Helping students, like Carlson with his thesis.
So the legend starts to build. Brilliant, charismatic, maybe a bit aloof, complex.
That's the picture, yeah. Drawing people in, but always keeping a part of himself separate.
Okay, shifting a bit to his personal life and political awakening. His mother's death in the early 30s must have hit hard.
Profoundly. That quote about being the loneliest man in the world feels very real in that context.
But it brought him closer to his father. Julia spent more time in California, met Einstein through Robert's circle.
Yeah, sad catalyst for a new kind of connection between them.
And Robert turns to philosophy. Sanskrit with Professor Ryder, Stoicism.
Seems like a search for meaning, for solace. Trying to find a framework to deal with grief and maybe the complexities of the world.
And the Bhagavad Gita resonated. Acceptance of duty, detachment.
Right. Not religiously, but philosophically. It seemed to fit with his scientific outlook, maybe offered a way to navigate things. A bit different from his ethical culture roots, perhaps more about acceptance.
Those New Mexico adventures sound kind of wild sometimes, pushing boundaries.
Definitely an adventurous streak, yeah. Not always practical, but willing to take risks.
But the 1930s, that's when the political awareness really kicks in, right? He wasn't interested before.
Not really. But the world was changing. Friends, colleagues, fleeing fascism in Europe, his students getting involved in causes. History was happening to him, not just in books.
And his brother Frank comes back in 35, more political, more radical.
Yeah, Frank was different, more of an activist. That contrast must have been interesting within the family.
Then Jean Tatlock enters the picture. Big influence.
Huge. Captivating person, deeply committed to social justice, involved in leftist circles. They had this intense, fiery relationship. She really pushed him to engage with the world's problems.
Got him involved in fundraising for Spain, joining the ACLU.
Exactly. And his friendship with Haakon Chevalier, another key figure on the Berkeley left, reinforced all that.
So he starts donating money, often quietly, through people like Pop Volkov.
But he always framed it as humanism, right? Helping people, not rigid ideology. Very him.
Interesting. He saw Dr. Bernfeld, a Freudian psychoanalyst around then, trying to understand himself better.
Possibly. Suggests an awareness of his own inner complexities. Meanwhile, Frank joins the Communist Party, which worried Robert.
Robert attended one party meeting at Frank's house but didn't join.
Right. Tried to understand it, maybe, but wasn't comfortable with the allegiance, the structure. He remained independent, though definitely associated with leftist causes.
He'd even tried to explain the Nazi-Soviet pact in a nuanced way, helped Chevalier with an anti-war pamphlet.
But he was becoming more aware of the risks, right? His profile was rising, investigations into radicalism at the university were happening. He started getting nervous.
Okay, let's talk relationships again, heading towards the war. Jean Tatlock, still turbulent.
Very. On again, off again. Near engagements, her pulling back. He seemed awkward, maybe struggled to show affection in a way she needed.
She was focused on her psychiatry studies, too, finding her own path.
Yeah, graduated, started working. Oppenheimer seemed a bit lost personally. Brief flings, but still connected to Jean somehow.
Until Kitty, Catherine Peaning Harrison, 1939. Sounds like love at first sight.
Or at least intense infatuation. And it started controversially. She was married. He was seeing someone else. Bit of a scandal.
And Kitty had her own intense past. Her first husband, Joe Dallet, died fighting for the communists in Spain. She'd been involved in the party herself.
Right, so she wasn't naive about politics. They got married, moved to Eagle Hill. A new chapter.
And right around then, boom, nuclear fission discovered.
Yeah. Oppenheimer was initially skeptical, apparently, but then quickly grasped the huge implications, chain reaction, the possibility of a bomb.
He's still mentoring students at Berkeley, creating this intense environment.
Amazing mentor, by all accounts.
Yeah.
Knew how to push, when to support, and his students were often politically aware, some quite radical.
There were early talks about mobilizing scientists, right? That meeting at his house with Kamin and Eltonton showed some friction already.
Yeah, conflicting loyalties, ethical questions starting to bubble up. Some students joined the FAECT union, worried about where their science was heading.
Oppenheimer stepped back from the union stuff, but the idea of scientists needing to organize to act was definitely in the air.
It absolutely was. The world was changing fast.
Which leads us straight into the Manhattan Project. His past politics caused suspicion, right?
Oh, big time. Lots of security concerns. But ultimately, his brilliance and the sheer urgency of beating Germany to the bomb won out. They needed him.
Groves knew they needed him, even if he didn't fully trust him.
Exactly. It was a calculated risk. And those early project days, there was this intense, almost romantic feeling, pushing boundaries for a vital cause.
Working out of an attic room at Berkeley initially, doing these incredibly complex calculations.
They quickly realized, yeah, a chain reaction is possible. But the scale, the amount of fissile material needed was just staggering.
And Oppenheimer thrived in that challenge. He became the intellectual center.
Absolutely blossomed. But the security stuff didn't go away. Some of his former students, like Lomanitz and Weinberg, got targeted, removed from the project despite his efforts.
And then the Chevalier incident blows up. Eltonton, Ivanov, the approach through Chevalier about sharing info with the Soviets.
And Oppenheimer's handling of it was messy. Confused timeline, delayed reporting to Pash, the security guy. It planted seeds of doubt that would haunt him.
Then the decision. Los Alamos. Site Y in New Mexico, which he loved, and he's central to setting it up.
Yeah, he wasn't just the top scientist anymore. He was basically the mayor, the chief recruiter, everything. Building this secret city on a mesa.
Sounds like chaos at first.
It was. But he somehow pulled it together. Brought these brilliant, maybe difficult personalities and made them a team. Dorothy McKibben in Santa Fe was key too, the gatekeeper.
And Los Alamos itself, that isolated environment, must have been intense.
Totally focused. Oppenheimer changed too. Became an early riser, this shepherd of minds. His quick thinking just amazed people.
But he had to navigate General Groves. Military secrecy versus scientific openness.
A constant balancing act. Oppenheimer was often the buffer, trying to make it work.
But the Chevalier thing wouldn't die down. His interviews with Pash were disastrous in hindsight, using words like treasonable, microfilm.
Yeah, the really self-incriminating language. It cemented Groves' distrust. The FBI got heavily involved. Lansdale investigated.
And Oppenheimer changed his story about who Chevalier approached. Even implicated Frank at one point. That's complicated.
Deeply complicated. And raises questions about his judgment under pressure. Though some people, like Ann Wilson, Groves' secretary, refused to spy on him. Showed loyalty.
Then Niels Bohr arrives, the wise old man of physics.
Huge moment. Bohr was already thinking about the post-war world, international control. He tried talking to Roosevelt, Churchill. He became a kind of moral compass there.
And really influenced Oppenheimer's thinking on the long-term stuff.
Profoundly. Planted the seeds for Oppenheimer's later advocacy for control, but Oppenheimer had to be careful what he's right. He was under surveillance constantly.
Yeah, Robert Wilson asked him directly why Soviet scientists weren't included, and Oppenheimer basically stayed silent.
Had to. Meanwhile, huge technical problems. The plutonium bomb needed implosion. That was tricky. Kistiakowsky came in, clashed with Parsons. Intense pressure.
And as the war in Europe ends, the moral questions get louder, right? Germany's defeated. Why do we still need this bomb?
Exactly. The Frank report argued for a demonstration, not military use. But the army shut it down. Oppenheimer was on the interim committee advising Truman, so he was kind of caught in the middle.
Sillard's petition against using the bomb. Oppenheimer didn't support it.
No, he saw it as too late, maybe naive. The momentum was too strong. The pressure leading up to Trinity, the first test, must have been unbelievable.
Long hours, immense stress, and then the countdown. Oppenheimer's quote,
"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," from the Bhagavad Gita, sums up the terrifying realization of what they'd done. The reactions at Trinity were varied: awe, relief, fear.
A turning point for humanity, no question.
Absolutely. The world changed in that instant.
So Trinity's a success, and almost immediately they're planning targets in Japan. But Oppenheimer's thinking is shifting, isn't it?
You can see it, the weight of it all. When Hiroshima is bombed, his phone call with Batcher is apparently very terse. He's not celebrating like Groves.
The moral reckoning is beginning.
Definitely. And then the post-war debates start. How do we control this thing? The Baruch Plan, international control. Oppenheimer was deeply involved. He really believed it was possible.
But it failed. Politics got in the way.
Yeah, the Cold War was already starting. He became pretty disillusioned. He actually predicted the arms race with chilling accuracy.
Talked about having a heavy heart, losing faith that science alone could guide humanity.
And then that famous encounter, or non-encounter, with Truman. Oppenheimer expresses his moral anguish, and Truman dismisses him as a crybaby scientist. Shows the gap in understanding.
Meanwhile, Oppenheimer is getting intelligence briefings about Soviet spying during the project. That must have hardened his views.
It seems like it. Made him accept the inevitability of an arms race, even though he hated it. It was a bitter pill to swallow.
He becomes this major public figure, advising the government, chairing committees.
Very influential. But the past kept catching up. The old political associations wouldn't go away.
Chevalier tries to reconnect after the war.
Yeah, and Oppenheimer gets really nervous, confirms he had reported their wartime conversation, shows how tense things still were. The FBI investigation ramps up again.
Hoover keeps digging, even though Oppenheimer seems to have cut ties with his old leftist friends.
Right. He eventually gets his Q clearance renewed in '47, but it felt tenuous. The scrutiny was always there.
So he moves to Princeton, director of the Institute for Advanced Study, a new start.
A different world, for sure. Quieter, more academic. But he still felt hungry, like something wasn't resolved.
Princeton. The ivory tower, almost. He wanted to shake things up there, make the institute more relevant, interdisciplinary.
Yeah, brought in people like Abraham Pace, who became a close friend, created this vibrant intellectual community. He still had that charisma, that influence.
But the political climate was getting colder. HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, starts going after people again.
Right. Former colleagues like David Bohm, Lomanitz.
Yeah.
And Oppenheimer's actions weren't always heroic. He blocked Bohm's appointment at Princeton, maybe trying to protect himself for the Institute.
Difficult times.
His brother Frank got caught up in it too, lost his job. Must have been painful.
Terribly. Then the Soviets test their own bomb in '49. Changes everything.
Huge shock. And it leads directly to the debate over the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb.
Exactly. A weapon potentially thousands of times more powerful. People like James Conant were horrified, strongly opposed.
Oppenheimer was conflicted. He saw the scientific possibility, but the implications were terrifying.
He found some common ground with George Kennan, the diplomat, who was also skeptical of just building bigger bombs.
Right, but he also clashed with people like Admiral Rickover, showing that intellectual disdain he could have for rigid thinking.
And Louis Strauss, his enemy.
Strauss just seemed to have it in for him, wanted him gone, stripped of influence. The Crouch testimony in 1950, alleging that old communist meeting at his house, just added fuel to the fire.
Even a brush with McCarthy during the Weinberg trial, the walls were closing in.
You can feel the sense of foreboding building throughout this period.
And then the trigger for the security hearings in '54, Oppenheimer writes an article arguing for more openness about nuclear weapons.
And Strauss loses it, sees it as undermining U.S. security maybe, or just the final excuse he needed. He goes to Hoover, gathers ammo, the hearing is set up.
It wasn't really a fair hearing, was it? More like an inquisition.
Pretty much.
Huh.
Einstein told him, just walk away, don't legitimize it. But Oppenheimer felt he had to fight out of loyalty to the country, maybe pride.
And the Chevalier affair comes back again. His admission of lying to Pash back in '43. That was killer.
Absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
Especially when they produced the actual recordings of those interviews. Contradicted his testimony.
Roger Robb, the prosecutor, just hammered him relentlessly.
Yeah, Oppenheimer didn't handle it well under that kind of pressure. Got evasive, seemed contradictory. Even his affair with Jean Tatlock was brought up. Just brutal.
Strauss must have been pleased. Saw it as Oppenheimer hanging himself.
That seems to be how he viewed it. And notice how Frank Oppenheimer's story was mostly kept out, like they wanted the focus squarely on Robert.
Even Groves's testimony wasn't as strong as it could have been. And Robb used that private letter where Oppie criticized Lawrence and Teller. Ouch.
Just relentless antagonism between Robb and Oppenheimer. His own lawyers knew they were in trouble. Volpe called it a damn dirty trial.
Some witnesses tried to defend him, right? Lansdale, Robbie tried to show the complexity.
They did. Robbie famously said the board shouldn't strip him of his clearance, that the country needed minds like his, emphasize his character, his contributions.
But Teller's testimony,
Yeah.
that was the knife twist.
Yeah. Edward Teller basically said Oppenheimer's judgment couldn't be trusted, that he'd hindered the H-bomb program, motivated by professional jealousy, wanting Oppenheimer out of the way. A later memo pretty much confirmed that.
It's striking how personal the Oppenheimer hearing was compared to the Army McCarthy hearings happening around the same time.
Totally different feel. This was targeted, personal.
So the Gray Board recommends against clearance, despite one dissenter, Evans, saying there was no new evidence, really.
Right. The decision stood. He lost his clearance, lost his official government role, but in a strange way, he became this symbol.
A martyr for science and conscience.
Kind of. Huge outcry from scientists. Joe Alsop wrote that scathing critique. Oppenheimer himself seemed to accept it with a kind of weary dignity, understanding the need to speak out, even if it cost him.
The whole thing traumatized the scientific community. Teller became pretty isolated afterwards.
Definitely. Oppenheimer eventually published The Open Mind, sort of a quiet return to public thought. Got invited to give the William James lectures at Harvard, which caused a stir.
Even marked McCarthy's death with a moment of silence. Complex guy.
Always. His later years at Princeton, interactions with people like John Nash, showed his compassion for fragile minds. He shared personal things with Jeremy Bernstein, revealing that ongoing desire for connection.
His friendship with the exiled opera singer, Ivan Jaden, shared values.
Right. Then life in St. John. His relationship with Kitty remained complex, their hospitality unique.
Battled throat cancer at the end. Mind still sharp, but body failing.
Yeah. That final reflection about maybe outliving his time is quite something. A sense of being part of a history that had moved on, perhaps.
He died in '67. Ashes scattered at sea.
A quiet end for someone who lived such a loud, impactful life. He remains this tragic figure, doesn't he? Embodying the moral tightrope of the nuclear age. American Prometheus captures it so well.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, what we have is this incredibly layered picture. J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Yeah, this brilliant, brilliant mind who unleashed this immense power and then had to grapple with it, shaped by so many different forces, full of contradictions.
Achievements and deep flaws side by side.
And his story is just as relevant now, maybe more so. It forces us to think about responsibility, don't you think? The responsibility that comes with knowledge, with innovation.
Right. In our age of AI, genetic engineering, whatever is next, the question is still there. Just because we can, does that mean we should?
Exactly. Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. In our time, with technology moving so fast, can science really serve humanity well without a really strong, conscious, ethical compass guiding it?
What are the parallels today to the choices Oppenheimer faced? It's definitely something worth thinking about long after this conversation ends. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.